Realm presents Silverwood, Episode 3.
"It's not far now," Harold said, gesturing to a small pile of rocks on the side of the trail. Taylor nodded and followed his friend deeper into the woods. "Just wait until you see it. You're not going to believe your eyes." Taylor had heard those words before, many times. But he trusted his friend. Harold knew a lot of cool things about the woods. He knew where to dig for arrowheads and worms. He knew how to track animals and read the stars in the night sky. He even knew how to mark a trail by leaving telltale signs such as piles of rocks or by notching trees. Having a father who was a Cub Scout leader had its advantages when it came to learning that kind of stuff. "It's right up here," Harold said, "near that broken tree. The one that looks like it got hit by lightning. I remember it." Harold picked up his pace, and then, just as abruptly, stopped short. A hustling Taylor slammed into his back and almost fell. "Sorry," he muttered. Harold didn't even seem to notice. It moved. He pointed at the base of a thick tree maybe 20 feet away. It was right over there before. He bent to a knee and studied the ground in front of him. "It's bigger, too. I'm sure of it." Taylor circled around his friend and leaned down for a closer look. Harold's description had been surprisingly accurate. It looked like a blob of black goo. It was about the size of a baseball, maybe a little smaller, and was glistening like it was wet, pulsating like it was alive. Harold sneezed, startling his friend. The sneeze sounded very loud in the silent forest. He wiped his nose on his t-shirt. "It changed shape, too." "It smells sweet," Taylor said. "Like candy." "I told you." Taylor watched as the black goo appeared to quiver slightly. It reminded him of a tiny black heart. He wanted to touch it, to pick it up and hold it in his hands. He wanted to take it home, but he knew better. First of all, it would be impossible to keep it hidden from the grown-ups. Secondly, if Gwen's dad found out he had it in their car on the way home, he'd get in trouble. "Well," Harold said, "what do you think?" Taylor looked up at his friend and smiled. "I think it's the coolest thing I've ever seen." "Okay, I think we're ready." Devin Fisher, dressed to blend into the woods, looked up from his clipboard. "Anyone seen Lydia or Tasha?" The two assembled groups remained silent. Several of the Hirsch Capital employees looked around. A couple others shrugged. Emilio finally spoke up, covering for his friend. "Lydia might be in the bathroom. I know her stomach was bothering her." Devin frowned. "Okay." He scanned the handwritten rosters on his clipboard. "Mary, do me a favor and switch over to Squad A. We can adjust the teams when the others get back." Mary Ng peeled off her vest and walked to the front of Squad A. Her friend Amber handed her a new vest and gave her a sarcastically pantomimed fist bump. The members of Squad A wore bright red mesh vests. The members of Squad B wore bright blue vests. All the employees carried paintball guns and wore narrow belts holding clear plastic ammunition tubes filled with extra paintballs. A handful already wore protective face masks. The others carried them. They all looked ridiculous, and knew it. "Okay," Devin said, a big smile back on his face. "The rules are simple. 2 teams start at opposite ends of the clearing by the appropriately colored flags. The woods are in bounds, but please be careful. We don't want to have to send a search party for you." "No sweat there," Mary said. "Don't have to worry about me. I'm not going anywhere near those woods." Everyone laughed except for Jeremy, who stood next to Emilio with the opposite team. "Good to know," he whispered. "She'll be an easy kill." Emilio gave him a look. "You did not just say that." "Once you've been hit," Devin continued, "put your hands up and keep them up until you've safely reached her home base. That will ensure that you don't get shot again by accident." Amber raised her hand. She wore tight pink yoga pants and an even tighter tank top. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Devin pointed at her, trying to suppress a grin. "Amber?" She cooed. I'm just wondering if it hurts? Karen rolled her eyes. If what hurts? He asked. Ember blushed. You know, when you get shot? Just a little sting is all. Devin scanned the two groups. Ember brings up a good point, folks, and that's safety. Two very important rules. First, never take off your face mask. Not if it fogs up, not after you've been hit, not even if you're sure no one else is around. Face masks remain on until the game is over. Second rule, never shoot at anyone from closer than 15 feet away. When is the game over? Carlos from the travel desk asked. It will be evening before we know it. It's over when either team runs out of players. Whichever team has the last man or woman standing is the winner. And what does the winner get? Jeremy asked, fighting back a sneeze. The winning team gets to walk around camp the rest of the weekend with the pride of a job well done, Devin answered. A few groans from the crowd. Listen, that's what this little exercise is all about. Teamwork, bonding, stepping outside of our comfort zones and working together to achieve a common goal. If you all can manage that out here in the woods, just imagine what you can achieve together back at home in the Hirsch Capital offices. A few robotic nods, a smattering of half-hearted clapping. Some whispered grumbles about why they were starting this so late in the day rather than tomorrow morning. Then Sherry from Accounts Receivable chirped, Come on, let's do this. That's the spirit, Devin said, smacking his hands together. He checked his wristwatch. We start in 10 minutes, so grab a drink of water, use the restroom, do whatever you need to do to get yourself in pre-game mode.
The vast forest surrounding Silverwood is strangely devoid of animal life. Sure, there's the occasional rabbit or squirrel rustling through the brush or scampering from tree branch to tree branch. But where are all the deer, the wolves and coyotes, even those pesky mosquitoes and horseflies, those delicate butterflies? There now appears a single crow, flying in from the east, silent and dark and sleek, gliding to a nimble stop among the highest branches of a towering black cottonwood. But the crow's sudden appearance only brings up the bigger question. Where the hell are the rest of the birds? The treetops should be teeming with these creatures. This magnificent forest should be alive with a cacophony of birdsong. The crow suddenly flaps its wings and takes flight, but it doesn't travel far. Instead, it coasts maybe a half-mile farther west, where it circles high above an old forgotten logging road before swooping down and landing on the gleaming metal hood of a tractor-trailer parked there in the shadows. The canopy of trees is especially thick here, blanketing the forest floor in an almost dusk-like veil of gloominess. The tap-tap-tap of the crow's feet on the truck's hood leaves tiny tracks across the pollen-coated metal and draws the attention of the man inside. He is crouched in the rear cab, peering out from between the driver and passenger seats. The crow stares back at him with unblinking, shiny black eyes. The man is large and bare-chested. A crucifix dangles from a silver chain hanging around his neck. His muscular chest and arms are slick with blood and gore. His face is a bloody mask. He snarls at the crow. Even his teeth are stained red. He grips a hunting knife in one hand and pliers in the other. The man looks away, focused again, back to the business at hand. The crow inches closer to the windshield. Tap, 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 for a better look. The man, a long-haul license attached to the truck's windshield in a see-through plastic pouch lists a Carl Hendricks as owner, is busy carving open a young woman's torso with the hunting knife. Blood oozes over his thick fingers. Excited by the scent, the crow unfurls its wings, emitting a black puff of pollen mist, and goes in closer. Tap, tap, tap. The woman is naked except for white sneakers and white socks, neither of which is very white anymore. She's been gagged with what looks like a light blue t-shirt. Her lips are curled in a silent scream, her eyes bulging in terror. The crow begins pecking at the windshield, slowly at first, then gaining in ferocity. A spiderweb crack appears across the glass. The large man ignores the crow this time. He wipes his sweaty brow with his forearm, leaving behind a fresh scarlet smear. Then he switches the pliers to his right hand and starts in on the young woman's face.
Well? Taylor looked up at his friend. Well, what? Is it an animal? Some kind of insect? It's definitely alive, right? I mean, I saw it eat a bug. The two boys sat across from each other on the ground. The blob of black goo was centered between them in a patch of dirt and weeds. Neither of them had dared to touch it. I'm not exactly sure what it is. Ugh, Harold groaned. You're no help at all. Taylor looked away from his friend, trying not to show how much the words stung, or the flash of anger that he felt. Hey, I didn't mean that, Harold said. I'm just excited and a little freaked out. Taylor nodded. Me too. You usually know everything about this kind of stuff. That's why I ran and got you right away. I've never seen anything like this before. Not in real life or any library book either. You're sure it's not a slug? Taylor shook his head. I did a report on slugs last year. It's not a slug. He used his forearm to wipe his runny nose. Geez, the pollen is crazy out here. What if it's from outer space? Harold asked. Really? Yes, really, like in that movie. I don't think I saw that one. You know my parents don't let me watch those kinds of movies because I get too excited. A big blob came out of a meteor or something and started eating people. Heck, a meteor could crash out here and no one would even know. I'm guessing it's probably not from outer space, Taylor said, examining the strange substance again. It had moved maybe a foot since the boys had arrived, but so slowly and with such stealth that neither of them had actually seen it move. They marked its progress with a pair of small twigs poking out of the ground. Yeah, probably not. Harold looked disappointed. But it sure would be cool if it was. His eyes flashed. Dude, we'd be so famous for finding it. We'd be on television and... You think it can hear us talking? Harold looked surprised by the question. I hope not. That's MLG levels of creepy. What's MLG? Major League Gaming? Sorry, I forgot your parents don't let you play video games. They let me play Nintendo, Taylor said, feeling the need to defend them. Another flash of anger welled up inside him, in time with a pollen-induced sneeze. Yeah, Harold jeered. Their old Nintendo from like the 70s or whenever. Taylor frowned. This teasing and negativity were not Harold's usual behavior. He decided to ignore it. I was just wondering, if it's alive, maybe it can see and hear us. Harold shook his head and inched a little farther away from it. You said you saw it eat a bug? Harold nodded, his eyes glued to the black glob. I'm just thinking, if it can eat something, then it makes sense that it can probably see and hear too. Harold picked up a nearby fallen tree branch about 2 feet long and poked it into the mysterious goo. He swished it around for good measure. Hey, Taylor barked, jerking forward and grabbing for his friend's arm. Harold yanked the branch back, clearly startled by the ferocity of Taylor's reaction. What's your freaking problem? This time Taylor didn't look away. Instead, he met Harold's eyes with an angry stare of his own. Even more unusual for the autistic boy. Don't poke at it like that. You could hurt it. Harold's mouth dropped open. Hurt it? You've got to be kidding me. But Taylor's attention had already moved on elsewhere. Look, he said, pointing at the stick in his friend's hand. The tip, the couple of inches that had penetrated the goo, had been stripped bare of bark. What the heck? Harold lifted the stick closer to examine it. Taylor got to his feet and walked a few yards deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning the ground in front of him. Harold stood up and followed. Taylor could tell by his demeanor that he was still mad, but also curious. It occurred to him that his parents and his therapist would be very happy with him for making that observation. They were always telling him to work on reading other people's personal cues. "What are you looking for?" Harold asked. "Something else defeated." "Now you're talking." Harold tossed away the stick and immediately headed off in the opposite direction, searching the forest floor as he walked. A few minutes later, Taylor called out, "I found some berries. We can—" Harold popped up from behind an old fallen tree where he'd been crawling on his hands and knees. His cheeks were smudged with dirt. "I found something much better." He held out his hands, which were clasped together, one atop the other, and slowly lifted the uppermost one. On the palm of his left hand sat a plump brown toad.
To take her mind off missing the Crypt Mag release, Lydia was thinking about movies as she followed the mysterious GPS signal on her cell phone deeper into the forest that surrounded Silverwood. More specifically, she was thinking about how movies were so much better than real life. You could rewind the happy scenes, the moments of excitement and success, and experience them again and again. And you could fast forward the unhappy scenes or the moments of failure and embarrassment. Real life wasn't nearly so convenient. Movies, even horror films and thrillers, were also safe. You could scare yourself silly for 90 minutes or so, but once the end credits started rolling, you could turn on the lights, toss the empty popcorn bowl into the sink, and head upstairs to a warm and cozy bed. Or you could slip on your coat, walk out of the theater, get into your car, and drive home. After checking the back seat, of course. Lydia stared at the screen of her phone and followed the red dot as it guided her off trail again, down into a ravine thick with thorn bushes and littered with old fallen trees. It reminded her of the deadfall from Pet Cemetery. I must be crazy, she thought, but she kept walking. Wasn't that what every doomed horror movie heroine thought at one time or another anyway? I must be crazy for doing this. Lydia sneezed, and the sound startled her. She managed a nervous laugh. As she slowly started to ascend the opposite side of the ravine, being careful not to turn an ankle, that would be a particularly bad idea this far out in the woods, especially without that rewind button to press, Lydia imagined a camera crew following behind her and pictured herself as the star in one of her favorite films of backwoods terror. The first to come to mind was the Blair Witch Project, the ultimate don't-get-lost-in-the-woods horror flick. Lydia didn't mind the shaky handheld camera shots that so many other folks complained about. And she didn't give a hoot about what any of the critics claimed. They were flat out wrong. Blair Witch was scary as hell, especially that wicked ending in the old abandoned house. The next movie to flash through her mind was Friday the 13th, the original, of course, set, appropriately enough, at a summer camp. Why hadn't she thought of that before? Camp Blood. Camp Silverwood. Maybe good old Jason Voorhees wasn't prowling these woods in a hockey mask, but it was still mondo creepy out here. And why was it so damn quiet? She'd recently caught another decent film at a local horror convention called The Ritual, about a group of hikers getting lost in the Scandinavian wilderness and running into a bunch of satanic bad guys. She'd really dug the first two acts, but had thought the ending was kinda silly. Plus, the cast was all dudes, not nearly as interesting to her. But her all-time favorite, which she thought of now as she crested the steep hill and, with great relief, rejoined the barely discernible trail, was an oldie but goodie named The Final Terror. Wilderness horror at its very best, complete with ahead-of-its-time special effects and cool-ass booby traps, and featuring the acting debut of none other than Daryl Hannah. Lydia had had a major crush on her ever since she'd watched the movie for the first time in 7th grade. Since then, she estimated she'd seen it at least another 50 times. Lydia stopped long enough to brush away a handful of brambles that had attached themselves to her shorts and t-shirt. Thanks to the sticker bushes, her bare arms and legs looked like a rabid cat had attacked them. She was about to retrieve her phone from her shorts pocket when it dinged, signifying a text had just come in. She pulled out the phone, switched off the GPS map, and looked at her text menu. The new message was a breaking news update from CNN.com. She started to ignore it and returned to the GPS map when she remembered the series of strange messages she'd received earlier in the afternoon. She opened the text and read it, and couldn't believe her eyes. Washington State Romeo killer Devin Fisher executed. Devin Fisher, 45, dubbed the Romeo killer by local police, was executed today by lethal injection at 2:13 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Fisher was arrested on March 17, 2016, for the abduction and murder of Morgan Lawrence, 23, a Harford County nurse. Subsequent searches of Fisher's residence and a nearby storage unit led police officials to believe that Fisher was responsible for numerous additional murders in Harford and other neighboring counties. After several weeks of questioning, Fisher finally admitted to abducting, raping, and killing more than a dozen women, including the missing daughter of Washington State Senator Barbara Meisner and Hearst Capital co-worker Amber Antonelli. Nicknamed the Romeo Killer because of his established pattern of selecting many of his victims from online dating services, Fisher continued to attract female admirers right up until the day of his death. Many of these women gathered outside of the Edgewood Federal Penitentiary early this morning to await the final word of his execution. "I don't believe he did it," said a tearful Martha Ann Pellegras, 35, from nearby Greenleaf. "I just know he's innocent. I corresponded with Devin Fisher for 6 months while he was in prison, at least 2 letters every week, and he was always so kind and such a gentleman. There's no way he's a killer." According to police officials, numerous items belonging to Fisher's victims, including clothing, jewelry, and even hair and teeth, were found in the rented storage unit. In addition, video recordings of several of the murders were discovered in Fisher's residence. "This closes the case on one of the worst serial killers in American history," said Edgewood Federal Penitentiary Warden Benjamin Sheretz. "There's not much joy today for the families of the victims or the local and federal authorities who prosecuted the case, but there is some measure of relief." When asked if Fisher had any final words, Sheretz reported, "He asked that we hug his mama goodbye for him. That was about it." Lydia scanned the article a second time, focusing on the names and dates and places, making sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. Her head felt foggy and slow. All this pollen was definitely kicking her butt, but she was still sharp enough to know exactly what she was reading. What the holy fuck is going on? The messages from earlier had been weird, but this was different. Kurt Cobain was a celebrity, but Devin Fisher? Her boss? That made things more real, somehow. A jumble of confused possibilities ran through her head. Had someone hacked her phone? Had she fallen on the trail and hit her head on a rock and she was dreaming all this? Had she slipped into some kind of alternate reality? Suspecting that the bizarre text wasn't the end of it, Lydia double-tapped the screen of her cell phone, closing her text window and opening her emails. Sure enough, there were 2 new email messages awaiting her, both from C addresses, the same company that had sent her the mysterious GPS location earlier in the day. Here goes nothing. She took a deep breath and clicked on the first email. From bperkins@seorg.net. To L. Johnstone @seorg.net. July 14th, 2011, 4:11 p.m. Leonard, sorry I missed your call. I got stuck talking to Charlie Kavanaugh again. What else is new, huh? Here are the numbers you asked for at this morning's meeting. Classified location A-07, plus 13.7, asterisk. Classified location CR-07, plus 12.1, asterisk. Classified location Lab 01, plus 3.2. Classified location Lab 02, plus 2.3. Classified location Lab 03, plus 2.6. Classified location Lab 04, plus 14.9, asterisk. I've tagged my obvious concerns with asterisks. Read my addendum to yesterday's field report and you'll see my exact reasoning. I've spoken to Dr. G at length and he agrees with my assessment, but only to a point. He is firmly in wait-and-see mode, and I'm not sure there's much either of us can do to change his mind. Alas, time will tell. In the meantime, I've ordered additional testing at all locations for next week. I recognize the personnel and security risks involved, but I really believe we need to stay on top of this or there may be dire consequences. I only hope, pray, that we're not already too late. Be well, old friend. Talk soon. Bryant. Bryant L. Perkins, Silverwood Engineering and Electrical. Silverwood Engineering and Electrical, Lydia repeated. That's the company that used to own the bungalows we're camping at. A bird called out from the treetops, as if responding to her. Lydia felt a sudden, unexplainable urge to find the bird and smash it with a rock. The wind blew through the trees, and for a second, it almost sounded like a voice. "Keep it together," she whispered. She sneezed and clicked on the second email. From M. Gustamonte at seorg.net. To J. Skidden at seorg.net, L. Johnstone at seorg.net, Eric Stad at seorg.net, D. Trump at seorg.net, T. Noel at seorg.net, J. McDonnell at seorg.net, G. Romero at seorg.net. March 9th, 2013, 9:02 a.m. Classified information, staff level A1 restricted. I am going on official record here and stating that we have lost control of the Black Box Initiative, resulting in loss of vital data, property, and personnel. It is my immediate directive that we close down and eliminate all C Silverwood-based locations, including A-07, Lab 04, and CR-07. Upon further direction, all bunkers and labs will be shuttered and sealed, and any continuing operations relocated to alternate out-of-state locations. An exit strategy and public relations cover story will be determined and distributed by the close of business today. Sincerely, Michael Gustamonte, Silverwood Engineering and Electrical. Okay, none of this makes a lick of sense, Lydia said. And why in the hell are they sending it to me? She looked up self-consciously when she realized she'd spoken aloud again. The woods seemed darker now, the air cooler. She blinked and glanced around. Where was the ravine she'd just climbed out of? There was no question she was standing on a different part of the trail. No, that wasn't right. She wasn't standing at all. She was walking. But when did I start walking again? The last thing she remembered was stopping to catch her breath, receiving the bizarre text about Devon, and then reading the pair of equally bizarre emails. She drew to a halt and studied her surroundings more closely. The path was wider here and cleared of most overgrowth. It was definitely darker now. Shadows loomed everywhere. Something tickled her face, and she reached up and wiped a runner of snot from her lip and chin. Disgusted at herself, she cleaned her hand on her shorts. It was like she had been in some kind of daze or something and had just woken up. A very bad thought suddenly occurred to her, and she quickly looked down at her cell phone. She tapped the screen until the GPS map reappeared. Sure enough, the red dot was farther away than the last time she'd checked. She'd been walking in the wrong direction. Lydia swallowed and finally admitted to herself, "I'm lost."
Harold and Taylor had returned to the mysterious blob of black goo and once again sat on opposite sides of it. Harold didn't like the tension that he felt between the two of them, but he wasn't sure how to articulate it in a way that Taylor would understand. Instead, he watched as Taylor carefully examined the berries he'd found and determined that they were non-poisonous. "Here goes nothing," Taylor said. He held out his hand, slowly opened his fingers. and let the dozen or so pale red berries trickle out of his palm directly atop the black goo. The berries sat there for a long, breathless moment, floating on the goo's gelatinous surface, looking for all the world like one of Harold's father's nightmare holiday dessert creations. And then the goo appeared to ripple and expand. And just like that, the berries were gone, and the glob of black goo had grown noticeably larger. Taylor swallowed. "Did you just see?" "I saw it," Harold said, his voice barely a whisper. "Ready for part 2? Harold shook his head. "Not really." "I can do it if you're too chicken." Harold fought back the horrible word that suddenly wanted to explode out of his mouth more than anything. In all the years that he had been friends with Taylor, he'd never once been tempted to use the dreaded R word. In fact, he had, on more than a few occasions, stood up to other kids, usually P.D. Carter, who would use the word to hurt his autistic friend. "What's wrong with me today?" "Who you calling a chicken, you dork?" he finally stammered. Taylor shrugged and once again refused to look away, his eyes cold and hard. The dreaded R word itched at the back of Harold's throat, and once again he fought it back. "Okay, you want it, you got it." He removed his top hand and flung the toad toward the glob of black goo. It landed a good 10 inches short of the mark and skidded across the ground until it was tottering on its side, an inch or two away from the strange goo. Then the toad tipped over and just sat there, unmoving, probably still in shock from being held captive for 15 minutes in a 10-year-old's sweaty hands, not to mention surviving its acrobatic tumble. "Great, you probably killed it," Taylor said. "It's not dead. You can see the stupid thing breathing. Then go ahead and push it into the..." Before Taylor could finish his sentence, a tendril of black goo slithered across the dirt and seized the toad, yanking it into the glob's center mass. It yawned open like some kind of slimy Venus flytrap and closed over the now alert and panicking creature. The toad's back legs poked out of the massive goo, kicking futilely at the forest air. A few seconds later, the legs were gone, and the glob of goo rippled and stirred. It was now the size of a football.
Lily from marketing adjusted her face mask and tightened the ammunition belt around her waist. She checked the safety on her paintball gun for the 3rd time in as many minutes. God, she felt like a total idiot. She looked around at her fellow team members. Judging by the expressions on the faces of those who hadn't yet donned their safety gear, many of them were experiencing similar feelings. Grown women and men playing war in the woods. What an utter waste of time. And why were they starting this so late in the day? Why wouldn't Devin wait until tomorrow to do this? If he had a reason, he hadn't shared it with them yet. But Lily was fairly new at Hearst Capital. She'd just started working there 6 months earlier, and she knew she had to play by the rules, even if the rules were ridiculous. Someone tapped her on the shoulder. She turned and couldn't stifle her laughter when she found her friend Emilio standing there, dressed in heavy gray sweatpants and sweatshirt, the hood cinched tightly over his head. She recognized him even with the safety gear on. With his face mask and wide, nervous eyes, he looked like a deep-sea diver. I know, Emilio said. "I look like a big fat pillow." Lily covered her mouth. "I'm sorry I laughed, Emilio. You just surprised me, is all." Emilio cracked a sheepish grin. "I figured it might hurt less if I wore some extra padding." "Oh, you've got extra padding, all right." Emilio's face suddenly grew serious. "Any word from Lydia? Do you think she's really sick?" Lily looked around to make sure Devin wasn't lurking close by. He was creepy like that, always spying on them from the shadows. She didn't see him, but lowered her voice anyway. "I have no idea. I'm hoping she's okay and just decided to skip out on the paintball festivities." Emilio rolled his eyes. "Whose idea was this, anyway? No way it was Devin's. He's not clever enough to think outside the box like this. I wish I knew, Lily said. I'd like to throttle the jackass. Emilio giggled. The game will begin in 10 seconds. Devon's voice boomed across the clearing. Oh my God, Lily said. Is he actually using a 10, 9, bullhorn, Emilio finished, shaking his head in disbelief. 8, 7, 6, Emilio sighed. Why do I suddenly feel like we're characters in the Hunger Games? 5, 4, may the odds be ever in your favor, Emilio said, bowing. Lily laughed and bowed in return. 3, 2, Emilio patted her arm. Good luck, honey, and took off jogging toward the trees. Oh, hell, wait for me, Lily said, following. 1, go!
Gear had been unpacked and stowed inside tents, multiple campfire pits dug and ringed with large rocks, and several piles of kindling stacked. Scouts and chaperones milled about the campsite. A couple of kids tossed a football back and forth. 2 more flung a frisbee. Others were engaged in a spirited game of horseshoes. A small group of boys headed in the direction of a nearby creek, fishing poles and bait buckets in hand. Fred Tallfeather stood up and leaned his guitar against the tree stump he'd been sitting on. He surveyed the camp, a worried expression on his face. Another chaperone strolled by, carrying an armload of twigs and sticks, and Fred hurried to catch up. Hey, Tony, have you seen Harold and Taylor anywhere? Tony shook his head. I haven't, but I've been out in the woods for the past half hour. How about Seth and Gwen? Tony lowered his voice, grinning. Not since Gwen put a whooping on that little bastard Petey. Fred's eyes scanned the trees again. Why? Tony asked. You worried about them? Seth and Gwen not so much, but Harold and Taylor. Those boys know better than to wander off without telling someone where they're going. Sorry, bud, I'll ask around. If you go looking for them, let me know and I'll come along. Thanks, Tony. Fred headed in the opposite direction of camp. He spent the next 20 minutes checking to see if the boys were down at the creek or hanging around back by the cars, or even doing their business in the latrine. When he didn't find them, he returned to the campsite. A million horrible thoughts swirling inside his overactive mind. He heard Hogan Carter's obnoxiously loud voice before he saw the man. The Patriots suck. They're nothing but a bunch of cheaters. No way they win that many games without Brady and Belichick cheating their asses off. Language, Fred thought, emerging from the nearby woods. Hogan was sitting next to his grandson, Petey, with a half-dozen other campers and an adult chaperone Fred had met for the first time earlier this morning. The man and his son were new to the group, having just moved into the area a few months earlier. Fred thought the father's name was Ryan, but he wasn't sure. Someone had gotten a good fire going, and they were all sitting in a wide circle around it in camping chairs or on the ground. As usual, Hogan was at the center of things, holding court. Now the Seahawks, that's a real football team. Great defense and a tough-as-nails grinded-out offense. One of the kids, Lamar, raised his hand and asked, What about the Ravens? Bunch of thugs and criminals, Hogan grunted. Baltimore is a garbage dump. So much for teaching kids about the beauty of nature, Fred thought, and cleared his throat. Sorry to interrupt. Hogan looked up and grinned that lopsided shit-eating grin of his. What's up, Chief? Fred ignored the nickname, as usual. Just wondering if any of you have seen Harold or Taylor. He hesitated before asking the next question, and then thought, the heck with it. Or Seth and Gwen, for that matter. Petey looked down at the ground at the mention of Gwen's name, still embarrassed by the beating he'd taken. What happened? Hogan grinned. Those pansies get lost already? One of those pansies just kicked your grandson's butt, Fred thought. But as always, he didn't give voice to his thoughts. It just wasn't worth it. But he still couldn't resist taking a subtle dig. Well, I know Seth took Gwen out for a hike so she could blow off some steam after that little incident earlier. Fred watched as Petey found something fascinating in the treetops to stare at. Anything to not meet the other campers, and especially his grandfather's, eyes. But I have no idea where Harold and Taylor have gotten off to. Hogan grunted again. Not my job to keep an eye on your kid. It's all of our jobs, Hogan. That's why we're here. To watch over and teach these kids. Timmy McNamara, sitting cross-legged on the ground, raised his hand. I saw Harold and Taylor an hour or so ago, Mr. Tallfeather. Fred walked over to the boy and took a knee. That's great, Timmy. Where'd you see them? Taylor was putting the rest of his stuff under his cot, Timmy said, pointing at the cluster of brightly colored tents. And Harold came running out of the woods all excited. A few minutes later, they left together. Did you see where they were headed? Timmy nodded. Back into the woods where Harold had come from. Fred didn't like the sound of that. He stared at the trees, concern in his eyes. Oh, for Christ's sake. Stop treating them boys like a bunch of babies, Hogan said, poking a stick at the fire. Fred looked at him with thinly veiled disgust. They're 9 and 10-year-olds, Hogan. What's wrong with you? Me? The man sounded genuinely surprised. What the hell's wrong with you? Aren't we out here in the middle of flippin' nowhere so these kids can explore the woods, catch their own fish, learn to shoot a bow and arrow, all that kind of stuff? Yes, under proper supervision, Fred nodded. But there are still rules to follow. Not my fault your kid doesn't know how to listen, Hogan shrugged. The other chaperone, Brian, sat forward in his chair. You want to organize some kind of search party? Search party, Hogan repeated, sneering. Fred thought about it for a moment and then shook his head. No, not yet. If they're not back in another hour, maybe. The sun was going down, but there was no need to panic just now. Hogan leaned back in his camping chair and crossed his hands behind his head. A USMC tattoo, commemorating his time in the Marine Corps, was etched across one meaty forearm. The bottom of his pale belly protruded from beneath his black Harley-Davidson t-shirt. All I'm saying is let kids be kids, Chief. They're probably running around playing cowboys and Indians or chasing deer around the woods. They'll be back in time for dinner, hungry and filthy and with stories to tell. I hope you're right, Fred said. Listen, when I was their age, I already had a .22 of my own. Me and my friends would spend all day in the woods, shooting bullfrogs and squirrels, hell, taking pot shots at anything that moved. Fred cringed inside. The Scouts believe in educating kids about wildlife and taking appropriate measures to preserve that wildlife when necessary. Remember the leave no trace vow? Sure. Tell me all about that next time you hit the grocery store and pick up a couple of steaks or packages of bacon. That's different, Fred said, and then thought, why even bother? Hogan laughed. Tell the cows and pigs that. Eager to change the subject, Fred turned and addressed the scouts gathered around the fire. So, what are you boys most looking forward to this weekend? Timmy answered first. Earning more badges. Steve chimed in. Climbing trees and playing hide-and-go-seek. The new kid, whose name Fred couldn't remember, leaned forward staring at the flames. Learning how to make a fire with 2 sticks. Fred looked to the left of Timmy and asked, How about you, Petey? What are you looking forward to doing? Petey didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at his grandfather as if seeking permission. He was probably still smarting from the scolding Hogan had given him for letting himself get punched by a girl. But don't just sit there like a dummy, answer the man, Hogan ordered. He hedged, his chubby cheeks reddening. Either catching a trout or learning how to trap an animal. That's right. Just like your old man and I used to do when he was a kid. Hogan sneezed, leaned over, and blew a snot rocket into the grass. God bless you, Kendall said. Hogan ignored him and continued his story. I taught your dad how to build a box trap for rabbits and squirrels when he was even younger than you are now. When he got a little older, we moved up to noose and snare traps. We'd catch 'em, kill 'em, and eat 'em. Right over a campfire most times. It's important to learn how to live off the land. One day, all of this," he gestured with both thick-fingered hands, "might not be here anymore. The power grid will go down, we'll run out of fuel and food, and then it will be chaos in the streets. And only the strong and self-sufficient will survive." The boys looked at each other, confused expressions on their faces. "I think I saw a movie about that once," Timmy said. "Oh, it'll happen," Hogan said. "Just you watch. Too many foreigners mucking around in our business, and not one of them wants what's best for this country. It's like we wasted our damn time over in Desert Storm. Didn't make one lick of difference. It'll happen. Just you wait and see." "Hey man," Ryan/Brian said. "Why don't we change the subject and talk about something a little more appropriate?" Hogan straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Why don't you mind your own goddamn business?" "Language, Hogan," Fred said. The big man ignored the comment and pushed himself to his feet. "Better yet, why don't you make me?" Fred stepped forward, hands held out in front of him. Hey, none of that." Ryan/Brian got to his feet. He wasn't nearly as stocky as Hogan, but he was easily 3 or 4 inches taller. His jaw was clenched and his hands were balled into tight fists. "I'm here with my son, so the paranoid garbage you're spewing is my business. And if you really want me to make you shut up in front of all these kids, it'll be my pleasure to see you try. That's your choice to make." Hogan hesitated. As with most bullies of all sizes, he wasn't used to being stood up to. He glanced around the group before his eyes settled on Fred. The shit-eating grin returned to his fleshy face. "Nah, I wouldn't want to piss off old Tonto here and have him send me and the boy home early, now would I?" He reached down and tugged Petey to his feet by the back of his shirt. "Come on, boy. Let's leave these sissies to their worrying." Fred stood beside Ryan/Brian and watched the two of them walk away in the direction of the tents. When they disappeared from view, he turned to the other man and extended his hand. "Thanks for that. I appreciate your standing up to him." The man shook Fred's hand. "No problem. What a Neanderthal." That's one word for him. "Although I have to tell you, I feel guilty about my response. That was way out of character. I don't know what got into me." "Must be all this fresh mountain air." The man laughed. "I think we met this morning when we were loading up the cars. I'm Chris Cabral." He put his arm around the young boy who wanted to learn to make fire with 2 sticks. "This is my son, Justin." "I remember," Fred lied, thinking, Brian, really? Not even close, man. He bent down and shook the boy's hand. "Nice to meet you, Justin." "Are you a real Indian?" the boy asked. "As a matter of fact, I am." The boy grinned, exposing a missing tooth. "That's so cool." Fred laughed. "You're gonna learn how to make a campfire this weekend, and so much more, I promise." "You sure you don't want us to help you find those boys?" his father asked. Fred let out a deep breath and glanced up at the sky. "Think I'll give it another 30 minutes. I'm trying really hard not to overreact. They ever take off like this before?" "No, that's the thing. Harold's a good kid. He knows the rules of camping. And Taylor, he's on the spectrum. He has autism, but he's very functional and smart as a whip. He'll stick close to Harold's side, I'm sure of it." He thought of Seth and how he was responsible for Taylor during the trip, which made Fred responsible in Seth's absence. He'd better stick by Harold's side. "Well," Chris said, "if you decide to go looking for them, stop by our tent before you head out and we'll join you. I appreciate that, I really do. And thanks again for before." "Anytime. I hate big mouths like that." Chris gave a 2-fingered salute, and he and his son strolled toward the campsite. Fred stood there for a moment longer, searching the shadows at the edge of the woods, glancing nervously at the sky and calculating how much longer it would be before dark. "Earth to Taylor! Earth to Taylor!" But Taylor didn't hear a word of what his friend was saying. His eyes and mind were locked tight on the glob of black goo lying in the dirt in front of him. He had asked Harold if he thought there was any chance the mysterious goo could hear or see, but he'd never thought to ask if he thought it could talk. After watching it devour the toad, Taylor wasn't the least bit surprised to discover that it could. He could almost understand what it was saying, too. If he could just have more time with it, alone with it, he was certain he could make sense of what the black goo was trying to tell him. But then someone was shaking him roughly by the shoulders, and Taylor suddenly felt the world rushing back at him in a blur of color and sound. "To Taylor! Dude, what's wrong with you?" Taylor blinked and looked up at his friend. Hey? You've been sitting there like some kind of zombie for 5 minutes and that's all you have to say? Hey? Taylor rubbed his eyes as Harold helped him to his feet. "I'm sorry. I must have been in shock or something. The last thing I remember was watching that thing eat the toad." He didn't know why he was lying, why he was keeping the goo's voice, if that's what you could actually call it. In reality, it was more like a deep humming from Harold. But it suddenly felt very important that the other boy didn't know, that no one else at all knew. "Man, you freaked me out big time." "I said I was sorry." "That thing is bad enough," Harold said, pointing at the black goo. "But then you went into a flippin' trance or something, and I didn't know what to do. I was about to run for help." "I'm fine," Taylor said, putting a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Really? If you say so." "I say so." "So what are we going to do about it?" "About what?" "You saw it eat that toad, man. You see how big it is now?" Taylor nodded, not understanding what his friend was getting at. "I think we should get rid of it." Taylor's head jerked up, eyes flashing wide. "What? Why would you even think that?" "Because I think something's wrong with it." Taylor tried to remain calm and logical. "Just because we don't understand what it is or know where it came from doesn't mean we should get rid of it." Harold started pacing back and forth. "Dude, it's a big blob of nasty goo and it eats things and gets bigger. If that's not a horror movie waiting to happen, I don't know what is." "We just need more time to study it." "That's another thing," Harold said. "All this time it was pretending it could barely move, creeping along a tiny bit at a time. But toss a big fat toad into the picture and bam, that thing can move like lightning." "So what?" "So I don't like it at all. That thing is sneaky and smart and hungry." "All the more reason to study it and find out more about it." Harold shook his head. "All the more reason to get rid of it." "I don't understand why you feel that way. You were so excited before to show me." "Something's wrong with it, Taylor. Can't you feel it?" "I can't feel anything," he lied. "Well, I can. I think it really might be from outer space or something. Wherever it's from, it's not from around here, that I'm sure of." Taylor shrugged. "We can't be sure of anything yet." "It'll be dark in another hour anyway. What are you gonna do, take it back to camp with you? Why would you even want to do that?" "Because it's rare and a part of nature. Because you don't get rid of something just because it's different." Harold stopped pacing and looked at his friend. "Okay, yeah, I get that. So then, how are you going to do it? How can you pick it up and move it without touching it?" "I haven't thought of that yet." Harold glanced around. "Maybe there's an old bucket or something lying around out here. I saw a couple empty beer bottles farther back on the trail. Not that those would work." "Maybe even a big, thick chunk of bark. I've seen some of those the size of the hubcaps on my dad's car out here." "Won't the goo just eat right through it?" "I don't know," Taylor said. "Maybe. Probably." Harold walked farther into the shadows beneath the trees. "Don't worry, we'll find something we can use." Taylor took off in the opposite direction, eyes scanning down the trail. "Don't go too far," Harold warned, and disappeared behind a tree. Taylor kicked at the brush, trying to get a better look at what might be lying hidden on the ground. He thought he might have spotted something faded red in the distance. Please be a bucket. But it turned out to be nothing more than the setting sun's reflection on a rock. He reached the top of a small rise and heard the familiar humming inside his head. Louder this time, and more intense. It hurt his ears. He had just plugged a dirty finger into each ear when a hissing voice inside his head cried out, "Trick!" He almost stumbled to his knees in shock. "A trick," the strange voice called out again. "A trick," Taylor repeated, not understanding at first. "A trick." And then suddenly he did understand. He took off running down the hill, tripping over an exposed root, this time actually falling, face first, scraping his nose and forehead, scrambling to his feet again, and sprinting back to the small clearing where Harold was standing above the glob of black goo, eyes burning with hate, a large flat rock held unsteadily above his head, skinny arms trembling, ready to lower the rock and crush it. "No!" Taylor screamed, and flung himself at his friend. He caught Harold hard in the stomach, and the two boys went down in a dusty heap. They rolled over each other several times, taking turns on top, arms grasping, fists punching, legs kicking, and came to a stop against the base of a nearby tree. "What's wrong with you?" Harold yelled, untangling himself and pushing Taylor away. He struggled to his feet. "You lied to me. You said you were going to help, and you lied." "I'm trying to do the smart thing, Taylor. You just don't see it. You're not acting like yourself." "You mean I'm not following your orders and following you around like a little puppy?" "No, that's not what I mean," he said, shaking his head. "You don't get it. There's something really wrong with that thing." Taylor laughed, and it was an ugly sound. He stood up. Both of his knees were bleeding. "You're a pussy." Harold's face went instantly red. "And you're a fucking retard." Both boys paused, staring at each other in shock. The words hung in the air between them, as thick as the pollen. Taylor shoved him hard in the chest. "Take it back. You take it back first. The truth hurts, I guess. You're acting like a big pussy." "I am not. It's bad, Taylor. Why can't you see that? At first I thought we should find the lake and throw it in, but then I thought about all those fish and frogs and geese it could eat. Then I thought we should bury it really deep out here in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't have a shovel. Why are you so scared of it?" Harold paused for a moment, catching his breath. "Because it's smarter than us, and it doesn't like us." "How can you know that?" He shrugged. I just know. Something's not right out here. I keep feeling angry." "You're so full of shit," Taylor said. He pushed his friend again, harder this time. "Take back what you said." Shaking his head, Harold said, "I won't." Taylor launched himself forward and planted both fists in the center of the other boy's chest, catching Harold by surprise, sending him sprawling backward onto the ground. He started to climb to his feet when twin tendrils of black goo snaked out and wrapped themselves around Harold, the first encircling his neck, the second tendril looping around his waist and cinching tight, like a glistening black belt. The tendrils began to drag Harold across the ground. Eyes wide and panicked, he kicked wildly at the dirt. "Help me!" He reached out with both hands. "Taylor, please help me!" Taylor didn't move. He wanted to help his friend, but his legs wouldn't work. He was frozen in place. The goo around Harold's neck slithered up over his chin now and flooded into his open, screaming mouth. "Help me!" he gurgled, hands clawing at the goo. But it was too late. Within seconds, it had completely engulfed his face, now a shimmering black mask. Still, Taylor couldn't move. Tears streamed down his face. The glob of black goo began to expand with frightening speed, spreading out and devouring Harold from his face down and his feet up. Within seconds, the two ends met, and he was completely consumed. When the woods were silent again, Taylor stared down at the enormous blob of goo lying at his feet and whimpered. The blob rippled once from end to end, reminding him of the glow-in-the-dark wave machine his parents had in their basement, and went still. Taylor thought that if the goo started humming again, talking to him again, he would scream and lose his mind right then and there. Instead, the blob began to undulate again, more violently this time, and then it started to rise. Taylor whimpered more loudly and managed to back up a step. He began to sob. The blob reached Taylor's height and began to heave and swell until it sharpened and formed an exact black, gooey replica of his best friend in the world, Harold Tallfeather. The Harold blob took a sluggish step toward Taylor, black glistening arms reaching out. Then it spoke. And that's when Taylor found his legs again. He turned and ran as fast as he could into the trees, falling and getting up and running again. From behind him came the loud crash of brush and trees being knocked down, and a wet slurping sound. Taylor ran faster into the woods.
You're listening to Silverwood by Richard Chizmar, starring Neil Helligers and Sarah Malo Christensen. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm. Listen away. Silverwood is written by Brian Keene, Richard Chizmar, Stephen Kozeniewski, Michelle Garza, and Melissa Lason. Based on Silverwood by Tony E. Valenzuela. It is produced by Lydia Shama and executive produced by Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, and editing by Amanda Rose Smith. Theme music by Brandon Roberts.